Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I am your mental curator, as always, Johnny Hemberger. Before we get into the, as I like to say, meat and potatoes of this podcast, of this episode, I just want to make an announcement. I have debated in my head in the past as to whether or not I should start a Patreon, and if I did start a Patreon, how would I go about it ethically? And it's kind of strange. I've talked to different content creators, and I've told them my position on Patreon, and they respected my ideology, but they also reminded me that there's nothing wrong with it, and they reminded me that these are donations that people don't have to make. You're not forcing them. You're not telling them some advertiser that you would rather, have them go use their services of. It's not like that. It's telling people how they can directly support you. And again, it's not forcing them to. So these different content creators would basically tell me I'm being too hard on myself by limiting what Patreon can do for people like us in our position doing what we do. So after I've debated, I've come up with a compromise. I have started a Patreon, and I will link them in these podcasts here. But I will only link the Patreon and plug the Patreon in digital content. That is, I will never plug Patreon on the air, on the actual broadcast that goes out over the radio station here in Houston. I will never plug it on air. I will also never plug the Patreon within content that has a sponsored advertiser. For instance, if I am in a podcast and I am telling you an advertisement for a sponsor of the show, let's say, okay, so in the past I've had Audi as a sponsor of the show. I've had Audi Central Houston as a sponsor of the show in the past. If I did another ad in a podcast for Audi Central Houston, I would not, in the same podcast, in the same show, ask people to donate to my Patreon. I will not advertise to you and then ask you to donate money to me. Does that make sense? That has always been my rub. That's always what seemed disingenuous to me, was to have me tell you about an advertiser and then tell you about my Patreon. I wasn't going to double dip like that. I'm already advertising to you, and that advertiser has already paid me, so I'm not going to double dip like that or remind you to go to the Patreon. Now, in podcast episodes such as this one, where I do not have any paid sponsorship for the podcast episode, yes, when there is no sponsor for the podcast episode of the podcast, I will not plug the Patreon, nor will I include the link to the Patreon in the podcast description. I will only plug the Patreon when it is not sponsored, when the show episode is not sponsored, and I will only include the link to my Patreon in that podcast description. So again, for example, if Audi Central Houston wants me to mention them, I'm not going to say, Audi, hey guys, go visit Audi Central Houston and also visit my Patreon page and consider donating to my Patreon. You will never hear that. I'm never going to advertise you and then plug my Patreon in the same episode. So I've explained it. No Patreon plugs in sponsored content. If the content is not sponsored, yes, I will remind my listeners in the podcast of the Patreon. I will never mention the Patreon on my broadcast. So over the airwaves, I will never mention the Patreon as well. The reason for that is simple. The broadcast is subject to sponsorship and advertisers. For instance, if you listen to the broadcast of Geek Therapy Radio, whether or not someone is sponsoring my show, still there are 4 minutes of commercials or whatever between each segment. So you're hearing 4 minutes of advertisements between each segment of the radio show. I'm not going to get back from those advertisements and then tell my listeners, hey, go give me money on my Patreon. That's why I'm never going to mention the Patreon on the broadcast. It doesn't feel right. It's only digital. I'm only going to do it on YouTube and podcasts that are not sponsored. All right, we can put that to bed. And that reminds me to remind you, hey, I've got a Patreon. If you want to consider donating to it, I will leave the description down below, but it's just Patreon, Geek Therapy Radio on Patreon. And the different tiers starts at $2 a month, and then it's $5, $10, and $20. And that gives you all sorts of different perks. At $2, I mention you in one podcast. So the next podcast after you sign up for the $2 donation, I'll give a shout out to whoever. For $5, I mention you at least once a month in the podcast. I give you a once a month shout out in the podcast. So let's say, like I said, at least once a month. So not every single podcast, since I podcast 5 days a week. It's not going to be in every single podcast, but once a month, I will give you a shout out. At $10, I give you one on-air shout-out. That is, I go on to the radio show and I give you a shout-out on the air. Hey, listener, but I'm not going to make it apparent that it's a Patreon or something like that. I'm just going to say, hey, a friend of the show, just want to give him or her a shout-out. Dale Bronson, from whatever, he's a good listener to the show. I just want to give him a shout-out. That's what that will be. $20 a month gets you a shout-out once a month in the podcast and once a month on the broadcast. So once a month in the podcast, I'll mention in the podcast, I will mention that they are a Patreon subscriber. On the air, I'll just mention it as they're a friend of the show. So that keeps everyone clear. That keeps me in the clear of, my own ethics. I'm not going to even mention Patreon in the broadcast, but I will mention you, give you an on-air shout out. And then there's, of course, tiers for like sponsors and business owners that I don't expect any of my regular listeners to even pay attention to. But just know that for regular listeners, between $2 and $20, I mean, of course, you can write in your own amount if you want. I will also mention, and thank you, by the way, we're 7.5 minutes into this podcast, and I'm going over some house cleaning with you. So I very much appreciate that you're still listening to this podcast. We will get onto the meat and potatoes of South Park and China and all that good stuff here in a moment. I do want to mention this, though. The last thing I'll mention about the Patreon is that 5% of it goes to mental health, to help those with mental illness. So 5% of the donation goes to Mental Health America, and that's before taxes. Even before I pay taxes on whatever my donations are, 5% of it goes to Mental Health America, and I include the link there in the Patreon page because I want to actually help spread awareness and give help to people suffering with mental illness. So before I take a dime, 5% of it, whatever you donate to me, goes to Mental Health America. You can also just skip me. You don't have to donate to me. If you want to just skip me and donate your $2, $5, $10, $20, whatever you want, you can just go straight to Mental Health America or donate it to any of your charity. I can't in good conscience say, hey, give me money and forget the charities. If you only have $5 to donate to me or to a charity, I would say donate it to the charity, okay? You can skip me. This is a humanitarian thing. You can skip me. If you only have $5 to give every month, give it directly to the charity. If you can spare a little bit more, of course, I do appreciate it. I want to tell you where the money goes if you do decide to donate to me on Patreon. So I'm going to read this from the description, which you can read too if you go to Patreon page. But I'm just, again, if you're a regular listener, you know that I like to keep things above the board and I like to keep you in the loop for everything. Keep it all above water. So your donation will not only help me bring you content and pay my bills, but offer some perks as well, usually in the form of bonus content and uncut interviews, segments, and shout outs. Sometimes I have notable guests on that are edited for time constraints, among other things. Maybe they might cuss or something like that. Pledges will have access to the full uncut audio as it arises. So let's say next time I interview the Angry Video Game Nerd and we talk for 30 minutes, but I have to cut it down to 15 minutes. my Patreon pledges will get that full 30 minutes. There's a lot that I've had to cut out from interviews, not just for cussing or anything like that, but just because when I have Colin on from This Does Not Compute, sometimes we'll stop recording, but we'll keep, or actually, no, that's not true. We keep recording, but no, Colin and I will keep going for 45 minutes or so. We've talked for an hour, I think, sometimes, and I got to whittle it all down. So I would give you those extra conversations. Of course, I would ask Colin, in this case, I would ask Colin first, hey, I recorded like 40 extra minutes, but he always says, anybody I interview always says, hey, use whatever you want of this. I mean, it's kind of just protocol for the industries. We'll record for 45 minutes, but we got to edit it down to the best 15 minutes or 20 minutes, what have you. I'm just saying, if you are a pledge on Patreon, you will get everything uncut. And if there is cussing in it, which there isn't usually, I will just put a marker on there that it's whatever it's rated. If it's rated PG, PG-13, or R, depending on the language, they'll have a warning, because I know there are some younger people, some kids, people let their children listen to the show sometimes, and I try to keep it PG rated, just because that's not in my nature to be all gross and disgusting like that, at least not on the air. You should hear me around the house. It is like you're on a pirate ship or something like that. Anyway, so yeah, that's all the Patreon stuff. I'm trying to be as ethical as possible about it. I've mulled over this for the last 2 years, but it's 2019. It's almost 2020. How content creators make money has changed. So I'm being forthcoming with you and forthright and clear to you about how I'm going to operate the Patreon as ethically as humanly possible. Some would say that I'm just being stupid, or not being stupid, but plugging my Patreon page after doing a sponsored ad, that doesn't bother a lot of people. Most content creators would say that's the name of the game, baby. You plug an advertiser and then you tell people about your Patreon. There's nothing ethically wrong with that. Well, maybe there's not something ethically wrong with that, but I just don't want to do that to my listeners. I don't want to go through 30 seconds of why you should buy this car at this car dealership or what have you, and then tell you should also donate $5 a month to me. I just personally don't want to do that. I'm not against making money. I'm trying to make money at doing this. I'm trying to feed myself, pay my bills, feed my small family, feed my cats. Of course, this is my job. This is what I do. But I'm just trying to keep it all above board and be as ethical with my listeners as possible. I'm not going to double dip on you. All right. Anything else I want to say? Oh, I've got a big show coming up this weekend. So this is the broadcast that, of course, does not contain any Patreon stuff that I already told you about. But the broadcast is huge. I've got a lot of guests on there, like I mentioned last night in last night's podcast. George Norrie, Clint from Lazy Game Reviews, and a bunch of others. It's going to be a very fun show. Coming up soon in the following weeks, I'm going to visit a recording studio and a gentleman named Chris Henderson who builds all sorts of amplifiers and preamps and studio gear and works with electronics and soldering iron, and it's going to be fascinating. I'm making a YouTube video out of that. I'm also going to make a YouTube video out of my arcade machine, take you on a tour of that. I'm already starting writing the script on that. Keep it all nice and tidy. But yeah, lots of cool stuff coming up here on Geek Therapy Radio. Okay, 13 and a half minutes in. Now we can start talking about South Park and Trey Parker and Matt Stone. And really, I'll start the conversation off in this way. I do not worry about the future of our country, and I don't worry about freedom of speech or lose hope in our country or lose hope in our human rights unless South Park and people like Dave Chappelle are censored. If our government ever censors Dave Chappelle or South Park for being politically incorrect or whatever have you, that's the only time I would worry. South Park and Dave Chappelle are very offensive. I would wager to say that if South Park hasn't pissed you off by making fun of your own personal sacred cow, that is to say, if you're liberal and South Park has said something that makes fun of liberals, I'd say that you're in the right boat there. South Park is doing a good job. If you're liberal and they've made fun of liberals and it's pissed you off and you don't like South Park now because they made fun of your sacred cow. Same thing for conservatives. If South Park makes fun of Donald Trump, which they do, they've made an entire season out of it. If South Park has offended your conservative sensibilities, good. Thank God that something like that can air in our country and commentary like that can be made in our country, even if it offends people. God bless that. Let me tell you why. Because as soon as you start censoring the other guy can censor you. If liberals want to censor conservative talk, that means conservatives can now, with every right, censor liberal talk. It goes two ways. It sets a precedent. I'm all about the precedents that actions set. So if the conservatives have their way and they say that you cannot talk about socialism in the United States, that's a loss for everybody, because now socialists can do it the same thing to conservatives and say, hey, we believe that what you're saying is offensive to us, so we are going to write laws that apply for laws that restrict your ability to speak. It's an eye for an eye, basically. It's old ways. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth are old ways. That's old law. It doesn't apply to the modern world. So if you get to censor your neighbor, that gives your neighbor every right to censor you. So it's either all or nothing, especially with comedy. So with South Park and Dave Chappelle, Bill Maher, and other comedians who push the boundaries, that's their job. They need to push the boundaries. I applaud South Park for getting banned in China. After the most recent South Park episode making fun of China, which is a freaking brilliant episode, by the way. I will include the link in this podcast. It is a brilliant episode. It pissed China off so much that China has erased all memory of South Park from any digital outlet. If you try to Google South Park in China, nothing comes up. South Park has been on since 1997. And if you go to China and you try to look for it, it's as if it never existed. If you talk about South Park, if you go on your Chinese Facebook page or whatever and talk about South Park, it's against the law now. It's against the law to even mention South Park. Thank God we don't have that here in the United States. And like I said, I'll only worry if that starts being infringed upon. If the government says Dave Chappelle can't have, if it has comedy, I can't even talk. If Dave Chappelle can't have his comedy special because it's offensive, that's time to worry. If the government says South Park can't air their next episode because it offends too many people, that's when I'll lose hope and worry as well. It's all or nothing. So some of you might be wondering, if you're living under a rock, what the big deal is. Why all of a sudden now has China gotten so sensitive to people speaking out? Daryl Morey, the general manager for the Houston Rockets, spoke his support for the Hong Kong protesters. China wants to basically impose their law again in Hong Kong, allowing prisoners to be extradited to China for sentencing, up to and including the death penalty, and not be tried anymore in Hong Kong, which was a British territory and free of Chinese rule up until recently. So the British left, and now China wants to rule over Hong Kong again and basically have anybody, if you break the law in Hong Kong, you're shipped to China for sentencing. That means you have the possibility of going to concentration camps, death penalty, torture, all sorts of stuff. So that's why protesters in Hong Kong are protesting. It is for basic human rights. That if you commit a crime in Hong Kong, that you stay in Hong Kong to be tried for your crimes and get a fair trial and get a fair sentencing in your free country or relatively free country of Hong Kong. Why would China have any sort of say over? It's really ridiculous. So there's been all this hubbub. Here's why it matters. Lots of American companies, companies all over the world, but for the sake of this argument, lots of American companies do business in China. China is a ripe ripe market for the picking. There are billions and billions and billions of dollars to be made in the Chinese market. So what happens is American companies, let's say the film studio that does the Avengers, they make cuts of the Avengers to appeal to the Chinese market so that they can air their product in the Chinese market and get $700 million in ticket sales from the Chinese market or what have you. The NBA is trying to establish relations with China and play games in China, and because there's lots of Chinese players on the NBA. Yao Ming, for one instance, they're building relations in China because there's lots of money to be made in China. So Daryl Morey, general manager of the Rockets, voicing support for Hong Kong protesters, that piss China off. And if you piss China off, that means the NBA is scrambling to undo the damage because they value money more than human rights, is what it basically boils down to. Hearthstone, the game Hearthstone, there's a player, one of the best in the world, I guess, and he was sponsored and everything. He voiced his support for the Hong Kong protesters, and his parent company axed him too. Said, nope, he no longer represents our company. That company said they value money over human rights. And the list can go on and on. It's a big deal. If I was to voice my support for the Hong Kong protesters, which I do. Okay, I'm going to let that sink in for a second. Of course, I voice my support for Hong Kong, the protesters in Hong Kong. What China's wanting to do is extremely unethical. So if I get my radio show shut down for that, so be it. I am not going to put money in front of human rights. I will never do that. I understand that every single company has their own right to do business wherever they would like to do business and have their own guidelines. And I understand companies having a guideline of, hey, when we represent you or you represent us, don't stir the pot. Don't shake the boat. Don't say anything political. Just do what we're paying you to do and don't, stay in your lane. Stay in your lane. If you're representing us, it would be like Ninja over on Microsoft's Mixer platform. He left Twitch and went over to Mixer. If Ninja went on there and said, I support Hong Kong protesters, it'd be, hey, you know what, parent company, is it Google or Microsoft? They might say, why did you have to mention that? Now we have to fire you because we don't want to lose money in our Chinese market. It is a ridiculous scenario that's been set up here. You catch my drift? We're supporting human rights takes the back seat to greed. And I'm not trying to be all pompous and preachy and what have you, but this issue has pressed this matter. And it's not beating a dead horse. It's kind of the new world we live in. There's a lot. China has grown in the last 2 decades. Their economy has grown exponentially into it. If they weren't a world power before, they're definitely a world power now. It's a giant cash grab. There's industry and business there that has yet to be tapped. In lots of industries, lots of businesses want to tap that growing market and their growing financial ability of their citizens. To buy Nike shoes and buy video games and buy refrigerators and watch TV shows and watch movies. Of course, Disney wants to get a piece of that Chinese pie. What's the population of China? Well over 1 billion. You can understand why they want a piece of that pie. As South Park said, if I can get 2% of the population to buy my product, we'll be multimillionaires. And that's true. So that's the rub. And a lot of companies now, and I think rightfully so, are have to come to their own conclusions now. Their nose is being pressed up against it now. They have to take their moral stand or not. Are we going to support people within the company supporting Hong Kong protesters? Or are we going to tell employees who represent us to keep their mouths shut in support of human rights? Because we do not want to shake up our investment in the Chinese market. So thank God for South Park in their reply. Holy crap, their apology to China was great, and I'm going to read it to you right now before wrapping this up. So Trey Parker and Matt Stone wrote their apology to China, and here it is verbatim. Quote, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. Xi doesn't look just like Winnie the Pooh at all. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May this autumn's sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China?" End quote. That is awesome. And I'm going to leave the show on that note. Thank you for listening. Be good to each other, including yourselves. Know that you are worthy of love, both giving love and receiving love. We're all geeks about something. Lean into your inner geek. Embrace your inner geek. And I'll see you in the next one.
Geek Therapy Radio, Saturday night at 10 on KPRC 950. Or listen anytime on our iHeartRadio app.